Everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Establishing a Vendor Management Program, Evaluating SOC Reports. You will see your webinar pane in front of you. Please note that the orange arrow will allow you to minimize or maximize the pane. If it is minimized, simply click on the orange arrow to bring it back. Feel free to submit any questions that you have for our presenters throughout the duration of the webinar. Our presenters will handle the questions at the end of the webinar as time permits. If you're using your telephone to listen in on our webinar, please make sure you select Use Telephone. If you're listening through your computer speakers, please select Use Mic and Speakers. If you have the incorrect setting selected, it will produce an echo sound. To qualify for California CE, you must use a personal computer and log in with your own information and unique URL. Be logged into our online software for at least 50 consecutive minutes within the scheduled time frame of the webinar. Actively respond to at least 75% of the polling questions and complete the evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. With that, I would like to introduce our presenters today. Jeremy Serharski has over 13 years of experience in audit support, internal audit, and process optimization. Jeremy leads the governance, risk, and compliance practice within Armanino, and his background helping companies optimize their compliance programs has helped form his consulting philosophy and approach. Jeremy has led over 50 SOX implementation and optimization projects. Next up, we have Steve Schaffner. Steve has more than 17 years of governance, risk, and compliance experience. He leads Armanino's IT governance, risk, and compliance assurance team. Steve has performed financial statement audits, disaster recovery and business continuity planning, risk assessments, and SOC compliance audits. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeremy.
Excellent. Thanks for that introduction, Sartaj. And good morning, everybody. I appreciate you taking time out of your morning to spend an hour with us here and hopefully walk away with some really good information regarding vendor management programs and things that you can be proactively doing on your end, both to implement as well as manage an ongoing vendor management program. So let's start with talking a little bit about the learning objectives. First and foremost, it's relatively straightforward. We're going to talk about the components of an effective vendor management program, the first of which is due diligence, and specifically doing your due diligence up front. We'll drill into this as we go through the discussion. We're going to explain what service organization control or SOC reports are and how they relate to the overall vendor management program and how they're really one of the first stepping stones that you're going to use for the ongoing maintenance of that program. We're going to explain your role in the process and really give you some good information for what you can do to help champion and own this process internally at your organization. So what does the presentation look like? Very similar to what I just described. We're going to talk about due diligence and maintaining this idea of ongoing compliance. And then we're going to drill into the role that SOC reports play in this vendor management program world, and really drilling in on how best to leverage an SOC audit report in the performance of vendor management activities. Because the key thing that really what we don't want to do here is just simply have it be a check-the-box activity. It really is the stepping stone to bigger and broader things and is really the first point of entry for a vendor management program from the maintenance perspective. And so with that, why don't we start off by having our first polling question.
All right. How would you rate your organization's vendor management program? Is it A, well-established, B, established but needs improvement, C, just beginning, D, aware of need but nothing yet, or E, what's a vendor management program? We'll give you just a couple moments to make your selections. All right, excellent.
Interesting results.
Yeah,
very interesting results. And as we're getting ready to close this poll, we'll show the results here momentarily. Please make sure you're getting your responses in. And in a way, it'd almost be good to ask yourself this question again at the end of the session today, and you'll see what the results are momentarily. But as we talk about what the components are of a good vendor management program, as we close, ask yourself if you would rate this question with the same answer at the end of the presentation. Well, let's take a look at what those results are. This is pretty consistent with what we see across most organizations. I think really it maps somewhat to a bell curve. If you're looking at most organizations have something that's established, probably needs to be improved and polished a little bit. I will say that's a little bit higher than I would expect to see. I think really where most organizations are, if we look at formal vendor management, it's probably more in the we're either aware of it or most cases just beginning. The fact that 11% asked what a vendor management program is great, because that's what we're here to help you educate you on as well. So with that, let's dive back into the presentation and let's start cranking through some of the details. So the first thing is really to ask yourself why organizations outsource, and really taking a step back is looking at kind of the history of outsourcing. If you look at really when outsourcing sort of became mainstream in business, it really started in earnest in the 1970s and started as a manufacturing exercise where organizations began to outsource a significant portion of their manufacturing by, instead of manufacturing a product end to end, they started dividing it up and having very specific contract manufacturers complete various sub-assemblies for them. Today, about 70 to 80% of most manufacturing is done through contract manufacturing. You fast forward to the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, service outsourcing was all the rage. If you recall, IBM really being the poster child of setting aside more than $25 million for retraining and relocation expenses as they downsized their U.S. workforce and stood up their call centers overseas, et cetera. And really the one that's facing us today that is all the rage is cloud computing and software as a service. And if you look at that, why that is so relevant to what's happening in business today, you just look at the investment. You know, in 2014 alone, companies are going to spend more than $13 billion on cloud computing services. Fast forward to 2015. By the end of 2015, that's going to jump to nearly $180 billion. So that's a huge investment in services, in capabilities and software that are outside the four walls of your building.
And that makes sense, right? Because most organizations don't deal with building management. And as a result, they outsource that to another firm, right? We lease our buildings and leave all those requirements to those experts. It's the same thing with IT. IT is now starting to get more aware of this, and we're seeing that shift to IT organizations, cloud hosting solutions. And that makes sense. Let those experts focus on that. Let us as an organization focus on what we do, what our core skill is, product, service, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you look at really what are a lot of those drivers, it's the same drivers that we've had going as far back as the 1970s, you know, when contract outsourcing was starting. It's the need for specific expertise, and in the context of software as a service and cloud computing, it's having the ability to go out and have a best-of-breed solution instead of having a 70 or 80% solution that is very common to sort of, you know, legacy, specifically legacy ERP applications. If you look at the ability to go out and get a best-of-breed solution like a NetSuite or an Intact, just even in the ERP space, it allows you to have the best that there is out there and then integrate with the other best-of-breed types of applications like a Workday for your HRIS, you know, Concur for your expense management, et cetera. It really gives you that ability to tap into that specific expertise. The next piece is it gives you capacity, and this is really just a key tenet of software as a service, is the idea that you have the perception to your end users of infinite scalability and infinite elasticity, the ability to go from 5 users to 5,000 users literally overnight, and you don't have to worry about it from a company perspective. That third party is performing that on your behalf. In doing that, they assume the risk. And this is a key thing to think about, and really the underlying theme of this whole discussion today is risk doesn't go away when you outsource. It's simply a transference of risk. And this is something that has gotten great clarity in the space that Steve and I operate in over the last handful of years. But when we first had this notion of the cloud, everybody immediately thought, great, I don't have risk anymore. Well, no, you do. You just manage it differently because somebody else is mitigating that on your behalf. And we're going to talk about how to make sure that you're doing this throughout the discussion.
Yeah, sometimes it's easier to think of it as assigning custodianship, right? You still have the responsibility, but you're having your agent take care of those things for you.
Exactly. That's a great point, Steve. And then last but not least, performing at scale, you know, lower cost for each customer, et cetera. That's really ties directly into capacity and scalability. You can go from, you know, as I mentioned, 5 users to 50 users literally literally overnight with a relatively low investment in terms of infrastructure, et cetera, on your side. Now, what does it look like from a lifecycle perspective? This is what I would describe a very straightforward, very vanilla vendor lifecycle, vendor management lifecycle diagram. And really, it always begins with the initiation. It's determining you have a need, defining the requirements, and going through the RFP process. I will say one thing to highlight here is making sure that the due diligence that you're doing up front as part of the initiation is really taken with the most serious eye, if you will. If you look at why projects fail, both from an outsourcing or from an M&A perspective, or really from an outsourcing perspective, the biggest reason they fail is one of two reasons. Number one, you didn't adequately define your requirements, or number two, you didn't go through the proper due diligence to determine, is this the appropriate solution to meet my requirements?
Well, and the cost of switching. If you don't do it right up front, oftentimes there are millions of dollars invested both in the service that you're outsourcing as well as the implementation. So if you take an outsourced ERP as an example, once you've made that investment, gosh, if we didn't think of everything we should have up front, there's a high cost to now do that again with another vendor.
Yeah, exactly. Not to mention the political capital that you may potentially burn being the one in your organization who championed a solution that may not be fully baked. We've seen this in some of our client base that we work with, where an individual really becomes married to a product, right, wrong, or indifferent, because they were the ones who it was kind of their brainchild. So once you've initiated and gone through that initial evaluation process, et cetera, you move into the contract process, and this really is something where your legal team should be involved, going through making sure that the contract has the appropriate terms and conditions, rights and obligations, et cetera. A couple things to point out here. Number one, service levels and metrics. I will say this is something that needs to be included, but is also very, very flexible in the provider's eyes. There's a lot of different ways that they can craft service levels to be very advantageous to them. If you look at uptime and things like that, it all relates to unscheduled downtime, et cetera, things like that. So I tend to not hang my hat on that as much. And really what you should be looking at as well is more of what is the availability to perform your own independent audits or leverage SOC reports. What is the dispute resolution process? Those are the things that actually have more teeth in them, that allow you to come back and have a more proactive discussion with them and a more meaningful discussion with them, as opposed to relying on service levels that really play into their favor. Once you get through the contract process and you've actually implemented, now you go into sort of the operation mode, where you're getting in, you're getting transitioned, you're getting up to speed, you're doing the ongoing day-to-day activities with either the outsourced service or software. One thing I will say that is very beneficial that I have several clients doing now is making sure that as part of the contract and operation sort of interrelationship there is to make sure that you don't commit to a term longer than 1 year without the ability to come back and renegotiate. That really is your out if, in fact, these service levels do not meet your needs. If you are not receiving the quality of service, et cetera, that you deserve. That's really the biggest thing that you have that you can use as leverage, is to be able to come back to these organizations and say, on an annual basis, we need to renegotiate for the following reasons. It could be service, it could be cost, could be changes in the marketplace, could be changes in your business. Key piece of that that you need to include both in the contract and operation phases. And then last but not least, transitioning out. At some point, you may outgrow that software. It could be the service no longer makes sense to outsource, to offshore, et cetera, and you may want to bring that back in-house. And in doing that, the biggest thing that I'll highlight here is making sure that you look at the recovery of assets, including information, data, et cetera. If you look at multi-tenant environments that are out there these days that sit behind a lot of cloud solutions, multi-tenancy effectively means we stick everybody's data into a single data structure, and we have ways to logically parse out what is Steve's data versus Jeremy's data, where in the past it was Steve had his own database, Jeremy has his own database. Well, in multi-tenancy, it can be exceedingly difficult to remove that data if, in fact, you are leaving that service, leaving that organization. So making sure that you understand what they can and cannot do in that respect, making sure you understand what their requirements are as part of that transitioning out process, and what they technically, from a technology perspective, are capable to achieve in that space. Very important not only in the upfront process, but also on the tail end of that relationship, making sure that you can transition that out in an orderly fashion.
Just a related thought on that, when you're looking at data destruction, you want them to destroy your data. That's not anything they need to manage anymore. They'll oftentimes focus on production, but are they thinking about their staging environment, their testing environment? Are they thinking about all the backups that they should have been making for you? Yep. So it can be quite involved to go through and really do a thorough destruction of data.
Exactly, and if you think about replication across, disparate, geographically dispersed data centers, if we're replicating data, on an ongoing basis, well, does that destruction replicate automatically as well, or do you need to physically go into each of the various locations and destroy that data and make sure that it is no longer being replicated? And at Steve's point, not only in production, but backup as well. So what are really the key things that you need to be focusing on as part of an effective vendor management program? Really, it comes down to two things. You've got the upfront piece and then the ongoing piece. On the upfront side, you've got due diligence. And it includes things like contract evaluation, background checks, reference checks, a lot of things that may seem somewhat straightforward and somewhat well-known. I think the key reason why we highlight these and why we're going to drill in far deeper is, at the end of the day, risk management rarely comes into play at the level it should as part of the due diligence process. It is very common for organizations to go through and look at reference checks and understand the capabilities of an outsourced service as it relates to meeting their needs, but risk management is commonly on the back burner. And as we talked about, risk does not go away. It simply transfers from one organization to the next. The next piece, once you've actually gone through the implementation process, is to make sure that you've got regular assessments, and we highlight here at least annually. Ideally, you want to be doing this more frequently, but we recognize that needs or that resources are finite. So looking at what are the monitoring processes for performance metrics, et cetera, the ability to perform independent audits, et cetera. Those are the various things that you want to look at. And again, we're going to drill down on each of these individually. So let's start by talking a little bit about due diligence and some of the key compliance-related contract terms that you really want to think about. Various ones here that we have. The ones that we really want to highlight is, first and foremost, the availability of an SOC report. Steve's going to drill into this a little more detail as the discussion goes on, but really this is, as we've mentioned previously, the cornerstone, the first stepping stone, if you will, of a strong ongoing vendor management program. What it is an independent audit report that allows you to assess what that organization is doing on your behalf. It can relate to services that they're performing, such as payroll, business process outsourcing, et cetera. It could relate to technology, things like security, confidentiality, availability, et cetera. So understanding what the availability of that report is and really what the content of it is. From there, other things that you would need to drill into is protection of intellectual property. If you're producing intellectual property, either in combination with this organization or if they're simply housing that data for you, what are their responsibilities as it relates to non-disclosure, confidentiality, et cetera. And it also relates to how they use data in the testing of their products and services. Do they have the ability to pull that data and put it into a non-production environment for a testing perspective? And this is something that came up quite a bit in prior lives that I've had around financial data, specifically credit card data. If it's pulled off of a production server and tested in a non-production server, well, obviously we don't want live credit card numbers being used in a non-production environment, but how do we also test to make sure that that production environment is going to handle credit card numbers correctly? So it gets into a bit of a catch-22. But understanding in detail how they're handling your intellectual property and what the confidentiality and non-disclosure components are. And then one area we've touched on already, which is the data retention and destruction. Destruction being really the key piece that is commonly overlooked. What can you be doing in the due diligence process to ensure you understand what that organization is going to be doing to facilitate the destruction of your data, either in an ongoing basis, for example, day-to-day. What if you call into a customer service rep and they are taking confidential information from one of your employees, say, for example, if it's payroll related? What are you doing to make sure that they have a clean desk policy, that they have the appropriate containers for destruction of hard copy data, et cetera, as well as part of the offboarding process to go ahead and remove that data from production servers as well. So as we drill in a little bit deeper, one of the first things that you want to do is perform checks. And one of the biggest things that I think you can do is really do a robust reference check. And this is where you want to reach out not only to existing clients, but I would also advocate, especially in the context of software, reach out to former clients as well. And this is something that may be a little challenging from a sales perspective on their end. Challenge your sales rep to give you a reference of an organization that's no longer using that software service. understand what the concerns were, understand how needs may or may not be met. That's going to really come back into a lot of these other areas around financial viability of a company, what their reputation is, et cetera. That's going to give you the ability to make an educated decision on whether or not this organization is going to meet your needs, not only from a requirements perspective, but also from a risk management perspective. Next, you want to go through the process and assess risk. You want to make sure that you obtain the latest audit reports. And again, we touched a little bit on the purpose of an SOC report, and we're going to use that a little bit more, dig in a little bit more as we go forward. You want to make sure that you also have vendors go through and complete a specific due diligence questionnaire. If you Google vendor management or due diligence checklist, there's about 1.1 million documents that get returned on Google, but there's a lot of them out there, and really what you want to look for is something that's holistic. It should be somewhere in the range of 1 to 200 questions that are really going to drill in deep. You want to make sure that you go through that process in great detail, because again, it's really your ability to get in, pull back the covers, and really see what everything looks like from a risk perspective. From there, you want to understand how you're going to monitor performance, and this really comes back to two different things. It comes down to what are the operational metrics you're going to monitor on an ongoing basis, and what is the process to facilitate that, and then how are you going to monitor performance in terms of their risk management. Now, operational monitoring really is how are they delivering on the various service levels. Is there on-demand reporting? Are you going to be meeting with an account rep on a monthly basis, et cetera, to understand how they are performing against the agreed-upon contract? I will say one organization that does this, I believe, exceptionally well is Rackspace. They're a hosting provider. They do exceptionally good job of operational reporting. Account executives meet with teams, with their clients on a monthly basis, step them through a very detailed report of performance as it relates to the services that they are providing. Really, really kind of gold standard of how to manage this operational monitoring process very, very well. Now, on the flip side of it, how are you monitoring risk management performance? This is something that may not be able to be done on a monthly basis. It may be something that's done maybe twice a year or annually, and this is where an SOC audit really is the first step in managing that ongoing risk management profile as well. And again, we'll drill into that here shortly. Last but not least, you want to be looking at the ability to perform independent audits, whether you do them directly, whether you leverage SOC reports or potentially other sources. You look at whether it's agreed upon procedures, industry-specific reports that become publicly available, like PCI assessments for credit cards, HIPAA assessments for healthcare providers, et cetera. A lot of different publicly available information that might be available that you can use as part of not only your due diligence process, but your ongoing evaluation process as well. So as we look at the regular assessments process, you also want to make sure that you have, as we talked about, the ability to, ideally on an annual basis, review the contract and renew if necessary, and revise if necessary prior to renewal. And this is really, it depends on the terms that you've agreed upon. Again, very, very strongly advocate that you have only an annual term, because that is the wild card that you can play if, in fact, market trends change, your needs change, your service levels are not being met, your risk appetite changes, and they are no longer meeting that risk appetite, et cetera. At that point, it may become an issue of negotiating through change orders, et cetera, but really what it does is it gives you leverage to dig in and have those discussions with your vendor without being locked into an excessively long term. So where to start? You say, great, Jeremy, you've given me a lot of really good information. Give me the playbook. You know, we're getting into football season here, so every Saturday from now till February, and Steve's nodding his head because we're both big football fans. Every Saturday from now till February or Sunday, we get football. So let's talk about the playbook. First and foremost, you have to draw a line in the sand and determine that as an organization, you will have robust due diligence and vendor management from this point forward. It becomes a commitment. It's a tone at the top type of message. It really has to come from the corner office. If you are in a line management position and you're trying to manage both up the food chain or up the org chart as well as down, it's going to be exceedingly challenging to be very successful at this. So you have to have upper management assist with this. Draw a line in the sand and determine this is how we're going to go forward. You then need to inventory what are our outsourced arrangements right now. What vendors do we use? And you will be shocked at how many there are out there. If you just think about an IT environment, it's not just your software as a service. It's who provides your data and voice connections, who provides your hardware maintenance, who provides your hardware redundancy, who does your backup tapes, who does your online data backups, who's your business continuity provider, who's your hosting provider. I mean, there are endless numbers. As we did this exercise with one organization about 4 years ago, we went through and they had roughly 80 some odd vendors that were being used just within the IT organization.
And those are probably just the ones they're aware of. I think the big challenge is wrapping your arms around this. A lot of it can be determined through your AP process, where are payments being made to, and then work backwards to identify vendors from there. But there's also the ability, especially with cloud solutions, to plop down a credit card, which a lot of business unit managers can do, and then they expense it. So it doesn't go through the AP process, it'll go through the time and expense process. So you really have to think of it holistically and approach it from a number of directions to identify that list.
Yep, and that's a great point. And so as you work through first gathering that inventory, next you then evaluate where those organizations stand as it relates to meeting the various requirements, whether it be from a contract perspective or from a risk management perspective. Go through, identify where gaps may exist, and engage with those organizations. Determine, if the vendor's willing to help address those gaps, and if not, look at what your options are, whether it be mitigating that risk internally by implementing a process, or potentially looking at that ongoing renegotiation process and potentially look at alternatives, etc. From there, next step in the playbook is going through and performing training internally and establishing awareness of requirements. And this may also require, to Steve's earlier point, some business process reengineering. If you're allowing individuals to go through and engage external vendors, and this ties directly into the consumerization of technology, it is so much easier for me to pull out my company card and engage a vendor for a service or software, etc., and then run it through on an expense report. Looking at how you clamp down on that. Do you have the right tools and processes in place to eliminate that or clamp down on it? It may require some additional process changes that directly tie into this point, which is making sure that you're raising awareness of these requirements throughout your entire organization. Anybody who can or might be purchasing things needs to be aware of how they play into this broader vendor management role. And last but not least, making sure you're establishing controls within your organization. And this is where it comes back to ensuring you've got the right AP procedures, making sure you have the appropriate legal review of terms and conditions and MSAs and things of that sort, making sure you have the right monitoring controls to catch if somebody is going outside of the process, if they are using either a personal or company credit card to purchase these types of services, and then making sure you have the appropriate issue resolution on that as well. This is really the 4 steps that you're going to need to go through to make sure that you're establishing the baseline of a very robust vendor management program.
And if I can just chime in on the bullet here about master services agreements, we're helping a client right now establish their vendor management program. And one of the catches that they had was they have AP set up so that they're only making payments on valid contracts. Well, what about when you have a master service agreement? So it's one overarching agreement, and then you have to have statements of work underneath that. So there were statements of work that should not be paid upon that weren't getting caught because they did have a contract in place. It was the master service agreement. So there's some nuance there, and again, it's just part of the business process reengineering and working with your people to make sure they understand what needs to be happening.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. And the last couple points here as we shift gears here. There we go. Sorry, advancing the slide here. Really tie into the ongoing monitoring. The first 4 steps really are about establishing the program. These are about the monitoring aspect of it, the ongoing component to validate, are we actually doing what we believe we should be doing, et cetera. So establishing the regular process to monitor vendors and monitor their compliance with various aspects of the contract, risk management activities, et cetera. And then last but not least, leveraging the SOC audit reports, again, at least annually, ensuring you've got the right coverage, looking for gaps, et cetera. And it's not just a matter of saying, hey, I got the report, check the box, and round file it. these really do need to serve a broader purpose and do need to be scrutinized at a high level to make sure that you understand in detail what is being done by these organizations on your behalf. All right, with that, let's pause momentarily and let's jump into our second polling question.
All right. What are your biggest challenges to establishing an effective vendor management program? Is it A, non-existent or weak executive support? B, business units don't always follow due diligence? C, existing vendor contracts won't renew for many years? D, not enough resources available to enforce program? Or E, other? What are your biggest challenges? And just as a reminder, we will be emailing you the complete presentation within 3 business days. And make sure to pull your selections to receive CE credit.
So we're at about 80, 85%. Let's give it just a few seconds more. Let's get that final answer in. All right. Let's take a look. So this is interesting results again. The leading one is D, not enough resources available to enforce the program. We do see that with, frankly, most of our clients. And this does take a lot of resource, not a ton, but it does take some devoted resource to ensure that you're compliant. Business units don't always follow due diligence. That's another one of the big challenges. Jeremy was just talking about that in terms of having the tone at the top and making sure that people know we're taking this seriously. Vendor contracts won't renew for many years. That one got a low response, lower than what I've seen at clients. Oftentimes we sign multi-year contracts and it's really hard to then layer onto those the types of things that we need, the ability to audit, the requirement for SOC reports, those types of things. So good responses. Let's go ahead and move on. So now we're going to shift focus a little bit more on the SOC reports. So SOC stands for Service Organization Controls. And if there's folks on here that don't know what those are, let's take a quick minute here to level set. So I'm assuming everyone here is a user entity. That's the company that would be outsourcing or that would be looking for an outsourcer. So you hire a service organization. That's the company that's you bought their service. And audit standards say that when I come to approach you as a user entity, that I'm supposed to treat an outsourced arrangement as if the service organization were an extension of your company. So to say that in a simpler sense, I would need to send my audit team to your service organization and do an audit of their service. Now, that's fine and good for one company, but when you expand this out, and I'm clicking my button here. I know it's taken a while to refresh. When you expand that out from the service organization's perspective, well, they have thousands or tens of thousands of customers. If each of those customers wanted to exercise their audit clause, the service organization wouldn't be able to provide the service. They'd be dealing with auditors all the time. That obviously doesn't make sense. So the AICPA kindly came up with a standard, which is the SOC standard, and it allows a service auditor, that's any CPA firm, to go do an audit of the service organization once, and then when all their customers are asking for the audit, what the company can do is say, here's the audit report that we already paid for, it's done to the SOC standard, you can rely upon it, let us know if you have any questions. So it's a lot more efficient and it addresses a need that is in the marketplace.
Yeah, exactly. And just kind of to highlight as well, Steve, 2 things. The SOC audit standard did replace what was formerly known as SAS 70. SAS 70 is still around for the performance of a financial audit, but not for the performance of a service audit. So we did see one question about, is SOC the same thing? SOC replaced it. And really kind of to add context to it, think about this from the perspective of, take payroll, for example. Not uncommon at this point to have your payroll outsourced. And to this point, your company comes in, payroll is a material number on your financials. You need to get understanding of how that process works. Well, hey, it's outsourced. Well, how do the hundreds of thousands of clients that ADP might have get comfort over what they're doing? And this is the exact way they do it. They produce an SOC report that then goes out to the various constituents.
Cool. All right, moving on. So let's dispel a myth or two. there are a lot of people still out there that believe if you get a SOC report, that means that the service organization has met a certain standard or a certain level of performance. And that's very not true. A SOC report is just an audit report. The standard itself, SSA 16 for the SOC 1, AT 101 for the SOC 2 and 3. We're going to talk a little bit about what the difference is between 1, 2, and 3 in a minute. But those standards are really about how auditors go about doing their work and how they create their report. If I go on to the next slide, which builds on this, the report itself is just an audit report, and it could include bad results. So I actually created one recently for an organization whose name I will not mention, but they had about 25 to 35 failures in their controls. I don't think they're going to be handing that report to their customers, but the reality of the standard is that report might say that the client service really is not as solid as you thought it was. So it's incumbent upon you as the user organization to read that report and make those determinations and make sure it addresses your risks and your needs. So let's talk a little bit about what I was just referencing. There's 3 types of SOC reports. There's a SOC 1, a SOC 2, and a SOC 3. So to Jeremy's point a second ago, the SOC 1 replaces what we used to know as the SAS 70. That one focuses on financial statement processes. And it's a little different than the 2 and the 3. For a SOC 1, you basically have that standard. It must address financial statement processes. But within that, as long as it's focused on financial statement processes, there's no correct amount of, should it be 1 control, 20 controls, 100 controls. It can be whatever you want within those boundaries. A SOC 2 and a SOC 3 use the trust services principles and criteria that were set out by the AICPA. So there is a standard that's out there that the report must address. Again, it doesn't mean that if you have a SOC 2 that you've met a certain criteria. It means that certain areas have been addressed by the audit. And again, that could indicate failures if those are present. The trust services and principles, trust service principles and criteria will address 5 different areas: security, confidentiality, processing integrity, availability, and or privacy. By requirement, you're not required to have all 5 of those. It could just be 1. It could be all 5. Typically what we see is security and availability, sometimes confidentiality in addition, sometimes processing integrity in addition, and I've seen a few cases where we have done all 5. They're very duplicative, so when you look at the requirements, they're very standard across, and we tend to approach those audits dealing with the same subject matter for all the principles and criteria being selected. Lastly, you can look at a couple things on here. We show the professional standards that are used. And a SOC 1 is a restricted use report. So that doesn't mean that you hand this out to anybody who wants it. In fact, you don't want to. These reports have your controls. That's your secret sauce. That's how you protect your IT environment. So you don't want to be giving those to everybody. SOC 2, usually you can hand it to a few more people. That's set out in the standard. And a SOC 3 is actually a very scaled down report. It contains a lot less information, but its purpose is for you to put a seal on your website, tell the world that you have it. So a little bit of information there about how they're used. There's 5 sections to a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. For most of you, if you're doing this for financial statement purposes, you want a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. The first is the service auditor's opinion letter. The second is management's assertion. Management's assertion for a SOC report is very similar to management's assertion for a SOX 404 assertion. So I'm hoping most of you are familiar with SOX, but that's the parallel there. Section 3 of the report is a description of controls. So you can think of this as a narrative. It's usually a text-based description of those controls. Section 4 has the testing results. It's usually laid out in a matrix format that lists the controls, the testing that was done, and then the test results. And then Section 5 is other information. And the thing to know here is that this is not included in the audit procedures done by the auditor that created that report. So typically the auditor is going to look at that information provided by the client. If it's going way off into left field and it's clearly incorrect, then we'll work with the client on that. But in most cases, it's just additional information that you might want. For example, in a SOC 1, the SOX standards usually require us to go as far as doing backups and testing our ability to recover. But most clients in an outsourced arrangement also want to know about BCP, business continuity, and disaster recovery planning. So that might be a section that would be in Section 5 of the report. Wait for the slides to refresh here. Critical information is spread throughout the report, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, let's go to polling question number 3.
All right, let's pull it up. Which of the following reports would support your organization's financial statement reporting and or SOX needs? Is it A, SOC 1 Type 1, B, SOC 2 Type 1, C, SOC 3 Type 2, or D, SOC 2 Type 2? There might be a few curveballs in there, so just be careful. All right, we'll give you a few more minutes to get your selections made.
So we're at about 86% complete right now. Let's go ahead and close it down.
All right,
so it looks like we fooled you on this one, because the correct answer is D. The key here is if you're doing a financial statement reporting audit or a SOX audit, you want a Type 2 report, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. For SOC 3, there is no Type 1, Type 2. There's only one kind of SOC 3. And for the other two that we had on there for A and B, a SOC 1 does address financial statements, but it's a Type 1 report. And that's not ideally what we want in that scenario. So let's go back to the slides. Thank you, ladies. So let's continue looking at SOC 1 and 2 reports. So if you're doing a financial statement audit, you either want a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 for different reasons. And for each of those, there's a number of things that you need to evaluate. Again, remembering these are audit reports, and they could include negative results. First of which is determining coverage. Does the service that you're receiving address, or so let me say that the other way, does the SOC report that you received address the service that you're receiving? And one way to look at that is geographically. So let's take this diagram here. So what this depicts is obviously a map of the United States, and the push pins here represent where your service organization has their data centers. Let's say that your service that you receive is serviced out of the Bay Area, but the SOC report that you get from them, if it addresses the Bay Area's data center, is good. If they give you a SOC report for their data center, say in Colorado, that's not going to work for you. The reason is this is a common strategy that a lot of outsourcers do. They'll have a number of data centers, and to obtain the SOC reports costs them a good deal of money. So what they'll do is they'll take all of their clients that require them and put those clients together in certain data centers, and then just get the SOC report for only those data centers. Oftentimes when you go asking for the SOC report, the person you're talking to may not even know what a SOC report is. So they have to do some digging, and if they get one, okay, customer of mine, here you go, here's a SOC report. So they don't know that they've handed you something that really isn't relevant for you. So it's incumbent upon you to review the report and look at it from that perspective. Another thing that you need to look for is the use of subservice providers. So we're going to start with the same diagram we had before. Here you are as a user entity, you've outsourced to a service organization. What you may or may not know is that they may be using a cloud service provider. So let's say you've outsourced your ERP to provider X. What you may not know is they do provide you the service, but that their servers, the infrastructure layers, they may have outsourced to something like Amazon or Salesforce. So that creates kind of a different challenge in terms of coverage for us. Then Amazon, and I don't know this, I'm throwing that name out there, so don't go calling up Amazon and be upset. But let's just say, hypothetically, Amazon may actually use a physical data center provider to host the physical systems for their cloud service that they provide to others, and so on and so forth. Then just to make this a really sticky situation, Tier 1 support might be offshored. And that could happen both at the data center level, at the cloud service level, frankly, at any of these levels. So the key things to remember here are 3. Where is your data processed? Where is your data stored? And who and where is your data accessed from? These are things that are important to know, because when you evaluate the SOC report, okay, there we go. And if we have a way of seeing if everybody refreshed, so I know some of you just got the full slide here. These are important things that you need to evaluate when you're reviewing the SOC reports, and the information is in there. So you want to know, are there subservice providers? And if there are, there's 2 ways the report can address those. One is called a carve-out, which says our SOC report is not going to address these subservice providers. In that scenario, what you also need to do then is the user organization is obtain the subservice providers' SOC reports and evaluate those. The other option when you're evaluating the report is what they call the inclusive method. And that would mean that the SOC report includes all the controls, both the service organization and any subservice organizations. Now, we mentioned in the last polling question there's a Type 1 and a Type 2 report. A Type 1 report only addresses a point in time. And for those familiar with the term, it basically is just a test of design. Basically says, I've looked at the controls, I understand how they operate. If they're functioning correctly, they should accomplish the objectives. A Type 2 takes that next step, which is what we want. And it says, over a period of time, it tests the controls for their operating effectiveness. And that's what we need for a financial statement audit. And frankly, if you want to place reliance on their controls and know that they're functioning, this is the type of report you need. A Type 2 is only available for a SOC 1 or a SOC 2, not for the SOC 3. Next thing to look at is the timing of the period of coverage of the SOC report. Because they aren't required to happen annually, they typically do. But you need to look at that in relation to your fiscal year and make a decision if the report has enough coverage within your fiscal year and close enough to the end of your fiscal year to meet your compliance needs. So on this next slide, we kind of outline what a typical timeline is for most people. Most service organizations usually cover a 6-month period, although I'm starting to see that go more to annually. It's kind of a rolling annual report. But the service auditor, the CPA firm creating the SOC report, they'll usually come in at the beginning of this 6-month period or 9-month period. They'll do the test of design portion. If it's a Type 1, they stop there. Most of them are doing a Type 2, and so they'll come back towards the end of the period. That's where the bar says test of effectiveness. And they'll complete their testing for the period of coverage, and then they'll finalize and get the report ready. That usually ends up with a report being issued late November, early December in most cases. And then the coverage of the report usually goes through end of October, early November-ish, sometime around there. So this is something, again, you need to consider to make sure that you're not getting a report from 2 years ago. If you do, that's not relevant for this year's audit that you need to perform. On our next slide here, as it's refreshing, oh, sorry, I was adding a couple bullets here. So if you don't have sufficient coverage, there's a tool called a bridge letter. That's the generally accepted term. Sometimes you hear it referred to as other things. But basically, this is a letter from the service organization on their letterhead that states, our controls have not changed since our last SOC report. So if the SOC report, for whatever reason, the period of coverage ended in April, and now we're in December, and we don't have the next SOC report yet, bridge letter helps give an additional layer of comfort regarding the controls and that they should still be functioning the way they were as of the last SOC report. All right.
Okay, let's jump into polling question number 4. What is the period of coverage for Type 2 SOC reports? Is it A, October 1st to September 30th, B, June 1st to December 1st, C, April 1st to October 31st, D, January 1st to December 31st, or E, any 6-month or longer period. I'll give you just a couple moments to make your selections.
Looks like most people are nailing this one.
Yeah.
Let's give it just a few more seconds. We're at 85. All right, let's go ahead and close it. So with about almost 90% of the audience responding, you guys definitely got it. It's any 6-month period or longer. You can see it with a shorter duration. The guidelines strongly encourage us not to accept that. If you see it, it's usually in a first-year scenario only, and that's because it's the first year and we're establishing the control. They want to get a report out, so we do that. Thereafter, though, we either get into a 6-month, a 9-month, or just a rolling annual reporting period. Okay, the next thing you need to look at is whether or not there was a qualified opinion. And the best way to describe this is, and I'm using just general street language here, that would be an opinion that says, hey, everything was fine. Oh, let me qualify that. There was this one area that wasn't. So that would be a qualified opinion, and that's a bad thing. What you want is an unqualified opinion. The other category here is an adverse opinion. And this would just be flat out when you read the opinion letter, it says things are not working. If you're seeing that at the opinion letter level, that's not a good thing. Another area is whether any controls are missing. So remember, with a SOC 1 report, that report only is required to address financial statement controls. What those are and how many there are is completely up to the service or the service organization, and then the auditor just comes in and tests whatever they're reporting. So you need to have a list of what controls you're expecting them to address, and then sit down, particularly with a Type 1 or SOC 1 report, and map that back and make sure they didn't omit any controls that are important to you and what your risks and your objectives are. Also, you need to look through Section 4 and see if there were any exceptions noted during the testing. Obviously, if there's a control that's not working, you want to understand the nature of that and decide what to do with it. Also, there's a section of the report called Client Control Considerations. The most common example of this is when you outsource an application to a cloud service provider. They're going to usually assign an administrator, quote unquote, administrator account to whoever it was in your organization that signed up with them. Now from there, you may want to assign other users to that service or website. You may want to assign that to others in your organization. That's going to be up to whoever that lead person who signed up with the service provider was. The service provider doesn't know when you hire people, when you let them go, who should have what levels of access. That's up to you. So that will be called out in the report in the Client Control Considerations section. And you have to look at those and make sure you have those controls in place at your organization for the overall risk to be addressed related to that service. Then for any missing controls, client control considerations, testing exceptions, etc., you need to implement your own mitigating controls to address the related risks. So that can be tricky in some cases. In other cases, it's not so hard. I'm moving along here pretty quickly for the sake of time, but I've reached the summary. So this slide, basically, I use it as a checklist when you're evaluating SOC reports. These are the general themes that you need to look at. There's a lot more behind each of these, and it's certainly something that will take a little bit of a time.
Great. All right, let's wrap up with our last polling question. What is the most challenging area to identify when evaluating SOC reports? Is it A, geographical coverage for your service, B, period of service, C, type 1 versus type 2, D, qualified, adverse, or unqualified opinion, or is it E, missing controls?
So we're at about 50-60% right now. Let's get our final votes in.
Remember, you must participate in the polling questions to qualify for CE credits. All right, and with that, let's go ahead and close the poll.
So I don't know that there's any right or wrong answer to this. I think it's a lot of what you need to look for is in the auditor's opinion letter. And being able to interpret that can be tricky because it's not, I wish they would put a cover sheet in there that just had check boxes for all these things so you could very clearly see what they are. But there's certain key terms and language that you have to look for to identify these things. Missing controls, I don't know that that's the hardest one to spot because the controls are spelled out very clearly in Section 4, but the time it will take you to map those back to your controls that address your risks is certainly time consuming, so I can really appreciate why many people answered that answer for this question. I don't know, Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, and just interjecting there, I tend to agree that I think missing controls is probably the biggest concern, primarily just because while controls are second nature to individuals like Steve and myself, because that's what we professionally focus on, it's not always the most intuitive thing for organizations. So determining if the report is missing something as it relates to what you feel you should have in place is definitely a concern, and also making sure that that the controls meet the internal standards you have. For example, with one organization that we worked with, we found that they had internal requirements around uptime that were very restrictive, very small. And as they looked at an outsourced provider, it was about 3 times longer than was tolerable. And as they did this review, it was like, oh my goodness, now we have to put a bunch of manual compensating controls in place because the software we're using does not meet our requirements. And that really ties back to missing controls, not only missing controls, but interpretation of the controls, timelines, etc. So I think those are really key. So let's jump in just the last couple slides here. Your role in the process. This is really straightforward. As we talked through it, it's really understanding what the vendor management process needs to look like and going back to those 6 steps and looking at how do we put the program in place, how do we get executive level support, and then how do we champion this on an ongoing basis. So your role really could be a variety of different things. It could be the one driving it, could be supporting it, could be one reviewing it. And really what it comes back to is looking at what is the most appropriate role within the context of your specific organization. So there's not one specific role that you can rely on here. So as we round the corner and head to home here, in conclusion, we've covered what are the components. We talked about the due diligence up front, the SOC reports. Hopefully we provided some additional clarity around how SOC reports work, how they're structured, what you need to be looking for, etc. And we talked through what is your role in the process, really in the context of each of those various topics, and then summarized it here as we wrapped up. And with that, I think we have about a minute to a minute and a half left for any questions. Please submit those through your webinar pane.
Yeah, so it looks like we have one ready to go. The question is, why is the SOC 1 reporting requirements not imposed on distributors?
Well, I think the key there is for SOC 1, it's covering a financial statement process, and we talked about that a little bit earlier.